Ladies and gentlemen, buckle up because what just happened on live television may go down as one of the most shocking media meltdowns of 2025. Look, we're talking CBS on a Sunday morning completely losing control of their own segment as brand new federal intel drops right into their laps, confirming that President Donald J. Trump's warnings about Minnesota's no-go zones, they weren't exaggerations, they were understatements. In fact, the moment that briefing hit the table, the anchor's face said everything. Panic, confusion, that sinking, oh no, he was right moment that they've spent years trying to avoid. But it didn't stop there, because right after the Treasury Secretary laid out the scale of the Minnesota fraud nightmare, right after DHS confirmed massive vetting failures involving East African migrants, CBS had Ilhan Omar sit in that chair. And what happened next? She was blindsided, cornered, visibly shaken as the host, normally her ally, suddenly had no choice but to press her on the facts. Then came the bombshell, a veteran whistleblower exposing the political machine controlling Minneapolis elections, live, with the host freezing on camera. Folks, this wasn't journalism. This was a televised collapse of a narrative that they spent years building. And tonight, we're breaking it all down. Hit the like button and subscribe. It only takes a second. Folks, the moment that this broadcast flipped from routine Sunday segment to full-scale media emergency, it happened in a blink of an eye. Right as CBS was preparing to run their usual soft focus interview with a Minnesota official, a new DHS intelligence memo hit the control room. Producers thought it was a mistake, but the anchor's earpiece lit up. Suddenly her smile dropped, her paper shook, and she glanced off camera like someone just whispered, "He was right." Yeah, Trump was right, guys. This memo wasn't theoretical. It was confirmed that Minneapolis now has multiple hard-to-police zones where multiple officers will not enter without backup, areas that mirror the exact warnings that Trump delivered years ago. And watching CBS scramble, watching them panic on air as they tried desperately to avoid saying those 4 forbidden words, that was the moment that the narrative collapsed. Trump was right. They know it, America knows it, and CBS just couldn't hide it anymore. Now, before the meltdown, the media spent years mocking Trump for calling out what he saw happening in Minneapolis. The fragmented policing, the breakdown of coordination, the refusal of local leadership to confirm the growing problem. From 2019 to 2024, Trump repeatedly warned that if the city didn't restore order, parts of Minneapolis were going to become effectively off limits for police officers. Now, back then, CBS laughed at him. MSNBC laughed. Every late night host rolled their eyes at Trump. They said it was fear-mongering, racism, exaggeration, anything to avoid admitting the problem was real. But now it's December 2025 and Donald J. Trump is president again. And with the power of the DHS, the DOJ, and the Treasury behind him, those early warnings are no longer predictions. They're investigations, they're federal findings, and they're being broadcast live on national television. Now, the irony, the same journalists who mocked him are now shaking in their seats as his wild claims turn into official DHS documentation. And now this is where CBS truly lost control of their own show, because right as they were still processing the DHS memo about the hard-to-police zones, another bombshell hit, a leaked internal report from a DHS whistleblower. And this one didn't target Minneapolis, it targeted Washington. Now, this leak exposed a massive nationwide bureaucratic failure. Thousands of migrant cases processed with incomplete, unverifiable documentation spanning multiple administrations. It wasn't ideological, it was incompetence, system failure, rubber-stamped approvals, shortcuts taken during the pandemic backlog that nobody wanted to admit existed. The CBS host already rattled, froze. She didn't blink. She didn't interrupt. She didn't even breathe, because this report confirmed that federal agencies have been waving through paperwork without proper verification for years, and that these procedural gaps had finally reached the breaking point. And when the guest asked, "Why didn't you report this earlier?" CBS had no answer, just silence. And listen, I need to say something very important, because what we're talking about today isn't just national security, media failures, or government oversight. It's also the same kind of everyday system breakdown that hits real people where it hurts. A viewer just told me that his medication jumped from $14 to $70 overnight. No warning, no letter, nothing. His medication plan had quietly changed tiers behind the scenes. He told me, "Ron, I felt blindsided." This is exactly why I partner with Chapter. They make sure that you're not ambushed by changes buried inside of your Medicare coverage. They read every adjustment line by line, every shift, the things that most people never even knew happened. Now, most people are already dialing the phone number at the bottom of your screen right there, or they're visiting askchapter.org/Ron to protect themselves from these kinds of surprise hits. Oh, and let me share this with you guys because it really meant something to me. So Paulette Diener wrote in, she said, "Thank you so much, Ron, for sharing about Chapter. Called them. They were able to communicate about my son's Medicare that has been a nightmare for over a year and give me advice that helped him get a plan that saved money and meet his healthcare needs. What a blessing. Highly recommended to anyone that is struggling with their Medicare." Hey, Paulette, Thank you so much for sharing that. Messages like yours really remind me why I push so hard to get good information in front of people. You didn't just fix a bill, you helped your son get clarity, stability, and peace. And stories like this, they always just hit me. All right, so I want to get back to the show. So after the leak, the floodgates opened, okay? Viewers didn't realize CBS had a second DHS document sitting on that desk, a classified summary outlining what's been happening inside certain Minneapolis neighborhoods from a purely governance and law enforcement standpoint. No group blaming, no speculation, just real hard data. And so the memo described 0 visibility zones. These are areas where officers lose line of sight due to street layout, abandoned properties, or dense structural patterns. It noted non-cooperative environments where local officials dispute federal jurisdiction, delaying joint operations, and most alarmingly, instances where neighborhood level leadership overrides state directives, creating pockets of administrative gridlock. None of this was about culture. It was about systems collapsing on themselves. But CBS didn't want to air this. The truth was very simple. The federal government had been raising alarms quietly, and local leadership just kept telling the media, everything's fine, don't worry about it. But when those two realities collided on live TV, the truth won and CBS lost. By this point in the broadcast, every CBS producer in the control room was sweating because the third shoe dropped, and it came straight from federal field reports compiled during President Trump's 2025 law and order overhaul. Now, these weren't political talking points. These weren't campaign lines. These were operational logs from agents on the ground describing how certain Minneapolis corridors required armored support or multi-unit coordination due to gang presence, abandoned structures, and unpredictable street layouts. And then the leak. Someone inside the CBS booth forgot to mute the internal chatter, and viewers heard a producer whisper, "Don't say no-go zone. Avoid that phrase." Too late, the guest already used it. And once that word slips out onto the airwaves, the host's face drained of color, because the very terminology that the media condemned for years had just been confirmed by federal documentation on their network, during their show, with their cameras rolling. Then came the meltdown, the moment CBS wishes it could scrub from every archive. The guest pressed harder than expected, began contradicting earlier statements. Who approved funding? Who monitored oversight? Who raised concerns first and who ignored them? Every answer dug a deeper hole. Now the host, normally polished, composed, always in control, suddenly became a cross-examiner. She asked follow-ups with a tone that suggested that she already knew the answers weren't lining up. This was the first time viewers saw daylight between the journalist and the politician sitting across from her. And as the guests scrambled to assign responsibility, pointing at state officials, nonprofit partners, court rulings, and even federal agencies, the desperation was visible. Instead of clarity, CBS delivered chaos. Instead of reassurance, they delivered contradiction. And instead of controlling the narrative, they broadcast a political unraveling happening in real time. Now, this is where the conversation shifted from uncomfortable to explosive, because once CBS realized that their guest was slipping, the Treasury Secretary's earlier remarks came roaring back into focus. The CBS host replayed, almost involuntarily, the fact that this entire scandal didn't begin with Minnesota leaders or local agencies. It started with the IRS Criminal Investigations Unit, which uncovered the welfare fraud while examining pandemic-era irregularities. And when Trump returned to office, the new administration quickly realized the fraud wasn't just a Minnesota problem. It exposed nationwide vulnerabilities in how states and nonprofits handled emergency federal funds. Treasury widened the probe. DHS widened the probe. Oversight committees widened the probe. The CBS host stiffened as the guest admitted the system allowed more than $1 billion to slip through unchecked. Not speculation, documented mismanagement. Now, this wasn't just a scandal. This was a federal wake-up call, and CBS had no idea how to contain it. Now, with the fraud narrative spiraling, CBS tried to pivot, but instead stepped on another landmine. Internal state party memos recently leaked described power clusters inside Minneapolis politics, tightly organized activist blocs, concentrated voting alliances, and coordinated endorsements capable of flipping entire precincts. This wasn't about ethnicity. This was about political machinery, raw and simple. Groups that mobilize voters with near military precision, outmaneuvering traditional campaigns, and reshaping primary outcomes. When the guest referenced the memo, the CBS host attempted to downplay it, but then the guest asked the killer question. Did your producers read the internal DFL reports confirming these clusters exist? Silence. Dead silence. Tiny little smirk from the guest, and suddenly the host froze, because those memos weren't rumors. They were real. They outlined factions with disproportionate sway over candidate selection, fundraising routes, and turnout models. CBS wanted to dismiss it, but the documents left them nowhere to run. This is where the broadcast blew wide open. A conservative journalist invited to provide balance decided he wasn't playing by CBS's traditional rules. As soon as the political power cluster memo came up, he dropped a phrase that sent the entire studio into full lockdown mode: imported voting culture. He wasn't talking about ethnicity. He was talking about the political behaviors that emerge when factions organize, mobilize, and vote as unified blocks, overwhelming traditional campaign structures. The CBS anchor panicked. She tried to cut him off. She tried to shift topics. She tried to shut down the segment. But the journalist didn't stop. He laid out precinct data, turnout anomalies, and internal emails showing party operatives scrambling to adapt to new factional voting patterns. So when CBS abruptly cut the feed, it was already too late. Clips of the exchange exploded across the internet before the commercial break even finished. And the story CBS wanted to bury, it became the biggest headline of the day. So the moment that the segment went off the rails, voters were hit with something even bigger. Trump's federal response was already underway, and it was far more sweeping than anyone realized. As part of his second-term crackdown on bureaucratic failures, Trump had signed a series of executive orders directing DHS, DOJ, and IRS to overhaul everything from vetting procedures to emergency funding oversight. CBS tried to label the reforms controversial, but the policies themselves were straightforward. A national identity verification overhaul to eliminate documentation gaps, expanded IRS task forces targeting nonprofit mismanagement, joint operation mandates requiring local federal cooperation in high-risk zones. Now, this wasn't political theater. This was the federal government correcting years of structural breakdowns both parties ignored until the fraud scheme and DHS leaks forced the issue. And so as the CBS host read the executive orders on air, the studio went eerily quiet. Trump wasn't just commenting on the crisis. He was already rewriting the rules. And so by this point, CBS wasn't running a news show. They were managing live credibility crises. Every attempt to steer the segment back to safe territory failed because the facts were no longer cooperating with the narrative. Internal messages began leaking the same afternoon. Producers warning each other, "We can't shield this. Just get through the segment." The audience noticed this. Social media erupted with comments asking why CBS ignored these issues for years, why warnings were dismissed as exaggerations, and why it took a DHS leak, a Treasury admission, and a federal fraud investigation for the media to finally acknowledge what residents have been saying all along. The network tried to frame the chaos as robust debate, but viewers weren't fooled by that. They saw the journalists caught off guard, scrambling, stammering over their words, stumbling over documents they clearly hadn't read. For the first time in decades, mainstream media wasn't shaping the story. The story was shaping them. And so when the cameras finally stopped rolling, one thing became undeniable. Minnesota had just become the center of the national debate over immigration policy, policing standards, election mechanics, nonprofit accountability, and federal oversight. Not because of political spin, but because the cracks in the system had grown just too big to hide. The DHS memos, the IRS fraud discovery, the governance failures, the factional political power struggles, the safety challenges, the documentation breakdowns, every pressure point collided at once, live on CBS, with Trump back in the Oval Office, federal agencies under new marching orders, and the 2026 midterm map shifting by the day. And as the network tried desperately to regain control, the reality hit them like a freight train. This isn't a local story. This is a national reckoning. Minnesota isn't the end of the conversation. It's the ignition point. And what comes next is bigger than any of them were prepared for.